I am pain.
Hey there guys, this is Richard, your host with another marvelous video. Hellraiser Bestiary is a thrilling anthology series that reimagines the Hellraiser mythos with Clive Barker's unmistakable touch. Breaking free from continuity, the comic explores 18 different horror segments, while one particular story about a gang of criminals stealing Pinhead's pins continues throughout the 6 issues of the miniseries. Newcomers like Ed Brisson and Michael Morisi join forces with horror veterans, bringing fresh perspectives to the iconic puzzle box. Overall, Hellraiser Bestiary is a must-read for horror fans in general, and Hellraiser fans in particular. But fret not, we're here to explore each of the segments in great detail. So, without further ado, let's explore the dark and the macabre. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. Number 1. Symphony in Red. Usually, when all hell breaks loose, it's a metaphor. However, when it comes to Hellraiser comics, it becomes a fact. There's always a hell of a lot of chaos, war, infighting, and far too many casualties. As you may have guessed, the stories are free of continuity, and it seems like mighty Pinhead had been on Earth for a while before returning to the labyrinth, where he's spending his time punishing the sinners Pinhead style. One of his followers was worried about Pinhead's current predicament. But why? Well, the Cenobites had been waiting for their priest for a while now, and upon hearing that he was back, they wasted no time in flocking like sheep to meet him. The congregation doubled with each passing day. The Cenobites gathered and waited, hoping Pinhead would grace them with his presence. He, however, had shown no such interest in addressing the huddled masses. His interest remained elsewhere but focused. Since his return, he'd laid waste to more sinners in 2 days than most Cenobites manage in a lifetime, and they live a long life. In fact, they're immortals, so that says something about Pinhead's current obsession with the violent, blood-soaked spree. The narrator of the story, Pinhead's follower, implored his priest to meet the congregation, but Pinhead wanted more bodies. Days passed, and the ever-increasing throng began to grow impatient. They demanded that their priest address them. Some even began to doubt that he'd returned at all. So they formed small factions, and soon infighting began among them. Yet, still as his congregation slaughtered one another in his name, he remained absorbed in his self-appointed tasks. The Cenobite who was bringing bodies to Pinhead was surprised to see the expression Pinhead wore while conducting his infernal business. It was all utterly foreign to him. What was it? Well, Pinhead was smiling. He'd executed enough sinners to drown another in the blood of the others. The next 2 pages are the epitome of gore and blood, with body parts floating in the air, their viscera splattering in every direction possible, and Pinhead was drenched in their blood. He was now satisfied and ready to address the congregation. You see, we don't learn about this side of Pinhead in the movies. Yeah, he's all ruthless in what he does and probably the most ferocious demon out there, but his thirst for blood and gore really comes to light in this small but effective story. Desert Fathers. This one here is probably the heaviest of the 3 stories from the first issue. The story begins on the outskirts of New York City, the Big Apple. At the Laurelton Family Center, a man welcomes several people in transit. In the beginning itself, they're warned that the 6th floor of the building is strictly off limits for children. Well, on the 6th floor lived an old man in a wheelchair who was happy that his dominatrix, Sandy, had arrived. But unfortunately, she'd come with Danny, and the couple threw him down to meet a gruesome death. The wicked are the doorway that the evil walks through. This was a saying of the Desert Fathers and Mothers, monks who roamed the deserts looking for answers but instead found demons. Likewise, Sandy and Danny, 2 wicked humans, were about to open a doorway for the devil to walk through. They'd found the lament configuration that belonged to the recently deceased old man. No wonder he was into some hardcore kink. Anyway, they solved the puzzle box to unleash a monster that looked like a cross between a bat and a xenomorph. The monster unleashes its wrath and the family center becomes painted in red. However, the men who ran the place were monks who managed to control the beast using chains. The demon transformed into what looked like a homeless person. But why was he here? Well, he was after the lament configuration. After receiving it from the men, he made a silent promise never to return. Not only is the story impressive in this one, but so is the art. Colin Lorimer did a fantastic job in bringing the monster to life, and he also shines with the expressions that the characters have. The Hunted, Part 1. Now, this one here has one of the most interesting Hellraiser settings that I've seen, heard, or read. So, a criminal opened a puzzle box, and Pinhead came to take what was his. But something interesting happens. Something that shocks not only the readers, but Pinhead as well. And that's saying something. You see, it was a setup to catch Pinhead himself. This young man was not alone. He had a bunch of baddies working with him who dropped a cage on Pinhead and then ensnared him in some sort of an energy dome before unleashing heavy fire on him. Pinhead was down, but was he annihilated? The bars of the cage stage had been inscribed with crosses, so Pinhead essentially failed to touch them, let alone break free. They bound him in chains with crosses on them, but what did these guys want from Pinhead? Why go to such extreme lengths and take such great risks? Well, they wanted Pinhead's pins. Yeah, you heard that right. Their benefactor was giving them $100K per pin, and of course, they thought the risk was worth the reward. That's where the first issue of Bestiary ends, and the second issue, instead of starting with the second part of The Hunted, actually starts with a completely new story. Old Hat to Raise the Devil. So yeah, and the second part of The Hunted is taken care of at the end of this issue. So let's get on with Old Hat to Raise the Devil. The story begins in the year 1940, somewhere between the rivers the Yazoo and the Mississippi. Now, most people are aware of the story of Robert Johnson, the man who some say traded his soul to the devil to become the greatest blues musician. We all know this part, right? But what this story does is it takes Robert's story and gives it a completely new spin, where a man, much like Robert, was waiting to meet the devil at the crossroads, but instead he comes across someone else, someone much more sinister. What could be worse than the devil himself? Well, I think you know the answer to that question. So, the man in question was sitting at a crossroads in the dead of night, waiting for someone, when a car arrived and crushed his hat, which was lying in the middle of the road. The driver stopped for a chat with this man, knowing full well that he was waiting for the devil to trade his soul in return for something. But what could possibly be worth his soul? He wanted to spend just one more moment with his sweetheart, Clara. The driver then gave this man a guitar, but it was no ordinary guitar. It was the doorway to hell, the guitar version of the lament configuration. He started playing the guitar, and it wasn't before long that Pinhead arrived with his gang. The man was astonished to see them. They certainly didn't look like the devil. Nevertheless, he still put his request forward. Pinhead told him that it was within his power, but he needed more flesh than one man's to grant the request. The man agreed and played the sinister guitar at juke joints, turning them into slaughterhouses. After 4 days, Pinhead presented Clara before the man. She was petrified as she was in the Chatterer's grasp. But here's the twist. It was actually this man, Calvin, who had killed Clara and was now repentant. But he'd committed a sin and needed to be punished, so he was, and in a manner, worse than death. Hellbound Desires. I won't get into the details of this one here because it's all about a young girl trying to make her way into the adult movie industry. But the man behind the camera makes her solve the puzzle box, and of course, things don't go well for the girl. In fact, even the man is taken care of by Pinhead. The Hunted Part 2. Now we're back with the only story that continues from the first issue, picking up where we left off. In this gripping chapter, Pinhead, the notorious Cenobite anti-hero, finds himself in a rare state of vulnerability. The story takes a dramatic turn when his abductors successfully strip him of his defining pins, leaving him powerless and much like a newborn kitten in terms of threat. They take out 138 pins, which essentially makes them 13 million. This unexpected development paints a stark contrast to the usual image of Pinhead, a character who revels in the intertwining of pleasure and pain. The artistry of Mears, Miller, and Magno is praiseworthy as they skillfully bring each character and scene to vivid life. The attention to detail in differentiating the thugs is commendable, steering clear of stereotypical portrayals and instead imbuing each with unique characteristics. Seeing Pinhead in such a diminished state is both shocking and intriguing. It flips the script on the typical dynamics of power within the story and offers a fresh perspective on the character. However, despite his weakened state, Pinhead's cunning remains intact. Left for dead and facing the threat of a building set ablaze, he devises an unexpected plan for survival and recovery. The climax of this chapter is as startling as it is ingenious, with Pinhead seeking refuge and assistance from the least expected of places, the Vatican. Known for its history of personal pain and self-flagellation, the Vatican comes up as an ironically suitable haven for Pinhead in his hour of need. Puzzled. Keeping it creepy aptly describes the third installment of Boom Studios' Hellraiser Bestiary series. In Puzzled, the first story of the third issue, written by Ben Mears, with illustrations by Achiel Guzman and colors by Matt Battaglia, the Hellraiser mythos takes yet another unexpected turn as it explores the nuances of Pinhead's character in relation to the concept of conscience. The story dives into autism, a condition that's now being increasingly recognized and understood in our society. So the premise of the story is quite simple. What if a child with autism, deeply absorbed in solving puzzles, encountered the most malevolent puzzle of all, the infamous lament configuration? This story follows Dale and his son Jeremy, who has autism. Jeremy's destructive tendencies are calmed only when he's engaged with puzzles. In his desperation to keep his son pacified, Dale stumbles upon the ominous puzzle box, unwittingly inviting horror into their lives. Jeremy's subsequent disappearance leaves behind just a bloodstain, which hints at the darkest outcomes. The twist in this tale is Pinhead's approach to his potential victims. His moral code is complex. He swims through loopholes to to find his amusement. However, in Jeremy, he discovers not just an innocent soul, but a potential apprentice, someone whose obsession with puzzles aligns with the Cenobite's own sinister predilections. Mears' storytelling prowess shines as he unravels the psychology behind Pinhead in particular and the overall Hellraiser universe, which balances its inherent chaos with a set of unspoken rules. Pinhead, known for not indiscriminately tormenting those who open his box, finds in Jeremy the perfect puzzle master, a role that promises endless challenges for the young boy. It's a haunting, thought-provoking addition to the Hellraiser lore. Conduit. Conduit is penned by Ed Brisson and brought to life through the striking illustrations of Alexis Ziritt with colors by Felipe Sobrero, and dives into the complexities of relationships and the haunting presence of the future. The story centers around Phil and Sarah, a couple taking a break, with Sarah retreating to her parents' home to sort through her thoughts. Phil, working on a prototype of an advanced puzzle box, starts receiving disturbing calls and videos of Sarah in distress. Ziritt and Sobrero's artistic collaboration deviates from the typical bestiary series style, as they offer a more saturated and somewhat hurried visual approach. This effectively conveys a sense of urgency and escalating madness, aligning perfectly with the story's mood. However, the story does leave some questions unanswered, particularly regarding the Cenobite's involvement. It's unclear why they target Phil, given his indirect connection with the puzzle box and the lack of clarity around his actions that may have drawn their attention. However, the chapter doesn't fully explain why Sarah needed space, leaving room for speculation about Phil's past actions. I mean, this guy stabs his wife, presumably killing her. The story's abrupt ending leaves key questions unresolved, which I think don't work too well in favor of the chapter. Despite these narrative gaps, Conduit managed to remain a compelling concept. It teases the reader with the possibility of a deeper, more intricate plot, but falls short of delivering a complete picture. The story's strength lies in its artwork and the mood it sets, capturing the reader's imagination and leaving them pondering the unseen connections between the characters and the malevolent forces at play. The Hunted, Part 3. Once again, we pick up where we left off. Since Pinhead's pins were difficult to pull out, the thugs carved them out of his face. Now, Cenobite Supreme is weak, fragile like any other mortal human, but he revels in pain. For pain and pleasure have lost the difference to mighty Pinhead. As Pinhead walks out of the burning building, he pledges to make the poachers pay for their violations in kind. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and ruin for ruin. And I'm not surprised. It seems beyond doubt that their celebrations will be brief. But Pinhead was enfeebled. He wasn't sure if he was ought to stand his ground or enter the conflagration. The welcoming embrace of the Inferno always wins, he thought. But this wasn't how he was going to die. It seemed like Providence had a plan for him yet. Suddenly, he smelled something unique, the beautiful, terrible, copper-tinged aroma of blood. But this was no ordinary blood, it was his own. He would recognize it anywhere. As Pinhead followed the smell, he came across the thugs who were dealing with a Vatican cardinal. That was a plot twist you didn't see coming, did you? So, the mysterious benefactor was this guy, or was it the entire administration of the Vatican? I mean, would a cardinal have 13 million? This clearly leaves us on the edge of our seats, in a manner of speaking. But alas, the third issue ends here. Study. Her name was Marion Railsby, a young woman in a deep and important spiritual relationship with Sophie Beauchamp, a socio-cultural anthropologist, but of a very unique kind. You see, she studied pain, facial scarring, tattooing, ritualistic piercing, etc., etc. Sophie wholeheartedly believed that pain showed you who a person really was. Anyway, Marion would stalk Sophie everywhere and simply look at her from a distance. One of these days, Marion watches Sophie as she goes inside an S&M club, probably the kind that inspired Clive Barker to pen down Hellraiser. All sorts of sadomasochistic stuff was going on in here. For instance, a woman's chest had been pierced by numerous pins. Marion followed Sophie inside the establishment, but she was nowhere to be found, which is when she received a note from someone telling her that Sophie was waiting for her. Marion found that the love of her life had been bound, but there was no point trying to bring her down. Instead, Sophie wanted Marion to solve the lament configuration. If Marion managed to solve the puzzle, they would set Sophie free. Of course, Marion did what she was asked to do, but Cenobite chains appeared out of nowhere. Naturally, Sophie was going to have the greatest study of her life. And God will send his angels. This one here is a story about a young girl named Rebecca and her abusive uncle. The girl's mother had died, and she was now living with her uncle, a drunk who often beat her up, and from the looks of it, I think he even sexually abused her. One day, Rebecca found herself in the attic, where she discovered a box that belonged to her mother. Inside it was the lament configuration, but before she could do anything with it, her uncle got to know that she was in the attic, a place that was off limits for her. He came up ferocious and vile. Rebecca was scared to death, so she rushed to her room. She would pray to God, begging him to send his angels to help her and kill her uncle. But Jesus wasn't listening. The poor girl started doubting her faith. Nevertheless, the night came and Rebecca found her uncle sleeping under the influence of alcohol, so she sneaked back into the attic to explore the puzzle box. Rebecca somehow managed to solve it, thereby summoning the Cenobites, namely Pinhead and his gash. Pinhead asked why she would summon them. In fear, she asked him not to hurt her. But Pinhead tells her that he, anyway, couldn't show her the ecstasy of agony since he was bound by the rules of the Order, which clearly stated that innocence should not be touched. Had Rebecca not been innocent, tears would have mourned the loss of her flesh, not expressed her trepidation. The female Cenobite asks her how it was that she got hold of the box, to which Rebecca says that it belonged to her mother. Pinhead corrected her, telling her that the box belonged to no one. It was just a tool, a doorway, and a means for them to locate souls worthy of torment. All this had woken the uncle up from his sleep, who came to check out what was happening. Rebecca requested Pinhead to save her from the man. Pinhead found the idea of stopping Rebecca's torturer a particularly interesting one. Well, he wasn't going empty-handed. He'd found what he'd come for, the flesh of a sinner. Rebecca asks if he was an angel sent by God. Although he didn't tell her, we know who he was, who the Cenobites were. Angels to some and demons to others. The uncle stepped into the attic only to be horrified at the sight of the Cenobites who had such sights to show him. The Hunted, Part 4. Things were getting heated up between the Cardinal and the leader of the thugs who had stolen Pinhead's pins. The Cardinal wasn't willing to pay the hefty amount. He didn't know that they'd bring all of Pinhead's pins, which was coming up to $13,800,000. But the criminals also had a point. They were standing in the basement of a palace, you see. And they owned the entire estate. The church. Pinhead was secretly watching the events unfold, and the man had a plan. Or Cenobite, for that matter. First, he had to retrieve what was his. Second, he had to get his powers back. And third, his favorite part, he had to lay waste. The Cardinal was clear that he wasn't going to shell out so much money, so he offered an alternative plan, a generous offer. The church needed only 5 pins, but he was willing to purchase 10. Actually, no, I don't think I should say the church wanted the pins. It hasn't been established yet. Nevertheless, Pinhead somehow managed to get one of his pins, giving him a fraction of his original powers, which he used to kill the Cardinal. The thugs opened fire on Pinhead, but to no avail. Pinhead used the Cardinal as a human shield. Pinhead escaped, and the bad guys suffered one casualty. Clearly, this story is taking great shape and has all the hallmarks of a perfect Hellraiser story for the movies. The only hiccup is that 4 humans managed to subdue Pinhead and extract his pins, but I'm sure that can be handled with a better explanation if the story is written by any decent script writer. Nevertheless, let's move on to the 5th issue. Don't Look. Manuel and Kate, a married couple, were present at the mental division of Danvers State Hospital. Why? Well, it turns out that Kate had been seeing several weird messages and stuff like newspapers, flyers, shopping ads, etc. These messages were sinister and supernatural, so Kate was admitted to the hospital. Manuel was initially being skeptical about Kate and her messages, but he soon started seeing reason in whatever she believed. Manuel was able to see the same messages. Kate wanted to go home, but Manuel wouldn't allow that. He believed that the hospital was the safest place for her to be, until he found out what was going on, until he got to the bottom of the truth. Kate begged and pleaded with him to take her home, but Manuel was having none of it. Kate was dragged away by the hospital attendants, while Manuel, on his way out, met with the doctor running the psychiatric hospital. He tells him that there was a sickness in Kate, and it sounds like it might be festering in Manuel as well. The doctor advised him to ignore what he thought was real, as all of these notions were nothing but a figment of imagination. Manuel argued that the thoughts and the sights felt extremely real, as if he'd had a foreboding that something was going to happen. He just couldn't pinpoint what. Later that night, Manuel was going through Kate's and his own notes to decode the full message. However, one of the attendants from the hospital had broken into his house. This man was torching the notes that Manuel had made. In fact, he put the entire house on fire. What was more concerning was that this man, being himself, had eyes as dark and empty as space, and something was going on with his poor face. Somehow, Manuel managed to escape the burning house. He ran until he reached the mental hospital, only to find that the patients were in a trance-like state, much like the infiltrator who burned Manuel in Kate's house. Before long, he found Kate naked and in the same state as the others. What was he going to do? He tried to make his wife snap out of her trance, but his attempts were futile. Kate solved the lament configuration, and it wasn't before long that Cenobites appeared on the scene and ended Kate's life. It turns out that the chief psychiatrist running the hospital was actually a servant of Leviathan. To prove his service to his lord, he sacrificed poor Kate. In the aftermath, we see Manuel as one of the patients at the hospital. The doctor gave birth to a false story that Manuel burned his house down. Folie à deux. Much like the title of the new Joker movie, folie à deux means the mental affliction shared by 2 patients who share a close physical space. This story is about 2 couples, Bert and Cliff, and Joel and Gar. Joel was in the process of being sober, so he'd prefer staying by himself most of the time. Bert went to check on Joel and found him reading a book called The Winding Way. The book sent them into an entirely different world with monsters and strange beasts. These were hallucinations, of course, but they found their way back into the real world soon enough. Later that night, Bert goes to see Joel once again, who tells him that the station master from the book has been speaking to him. In fact, Joel was also hearing the same. In reality, the book was a version of the lament configuration, and the station master was a Cenobite. Within seconds, chains appeared out of nowhere and stitched the two friends into one body. When the cops later arrived, one of them noted, "I'll try my best to separate them, but any which way you slice it, you're gonna get half a dozen of one and half a dozen of the other." The Hunted, Part 5. We're back with the penultimate part of The Hunted, the only story that's continued since the first issue. In the last segment, we saw how Pinhead had escaped gunfire after killing one of his assaulters and the Vatican Cardinal. Here, the remaining three are chasing Pinhead, but he's nowhere to be found. Unbeknownst to them, he's right behind them, waiting for the opportune moment to make the kill. He was out of his powers, so he couldn't summon any chains, but he still needed a weapon to stand against three heavily armed thugs. So he rips out a bone from his own chest to use as a weapon, while the leader of the group flaunted about burning down entire cities and how Pinhead was just another cockroach in a sea of insects. Pinhead snuck up behind another one of the criminals and stuck his makeshift weapon into his neck, killing him. Before the other one could react, Pinhead killed her as well. He was silent as a cat. On the other hand, the leader was yet to notice that he was about to face Pinhead alone. But the leader was one piece of meat, and Pinhead was still extremely weak. But God and fate work in mysterious ways. Pinhead somehow managed to open a hidden door which housed the artifacts from across time, pillaged by an impressively brutal inquisition. He knew that this chamber of secrets housed his salvation. Braving heavy gunfire, Pinhead made a move toward this room of requirements, if you will. Just as he'd expected, he found what he was looking for, a lament configuration. Wasting no time, he solved the puzzle box, summoning his dear associates. But unfortunately, that's yet another cliffhanger that the writers chose to throw at us. And with that, it's time to explore the final issue of the series. Place for everything. This one is about an old woman living in a suburban neighborhood. House after house of perfect lawns, spacious living rooms, and happy families, one after another. This was the setting of her locality. But the old woman was not really welcome there. She knew she was a bit different from the crowd, but how different? We're about to find out. She noticed the sidelong stare and the whispers people shared when she passed by them, but she only cared about her secrets. The secrets that no one could know. If the people found out about her said secrets, they'd take it all away, leaving her alone and morose. Her childhood was left behind in dozens of apartments and trailers and borrowed bedrooms. Pieces of her thrown away like trash scattered across the country. Why? Well, she lived well into her adulthood with her mother, and whenever they moved from one place to another, her mother took only those houses that could fit into their trailer, nothing more. When she got a job as a librarian, the first thing she did was find a house to rent. Soon she met a man named John, a security guard. The two of them got married and they bought the house together. They built a little life together and had a couple of children named Sally and John. But after the birth of her children, she started getting more nervous about losing them or forgetting their childhood and all the memories they'd made together. So she started hoarding things into the house. She would keep every report card, every finger-painted portrait. She even kept the clothes after they'd outgrown them. All this to ensure that she could hold these things and remember when the kids were smaller and safer. John often said that she was crazy and that she needed to let things go. The kids seconded him. They were annoyed and ashamed that the family could never let anyone see the insides of the house because it was so cluttered with things. Things no one needed. Things that had only one purpose, serving the obsession of the lady in question. Sally once asked her mother why the latter considered things more important than her family. But the lady believed that she wasn't replacing people with stuff. Instead, she was using the stuff to feel more connected to her family. She hoarded everything, whatever she could find, every little thing that was once related to any one of her three family members. And with all these things, she created a perfect home, with a place for everything, or so she believed. But of course, there's a twist. John always loved the living room, so it seemed to her that the living room was the best place to leave his body. Yeah, you heard that right. Sally always spent so much time in the bathroom. She lived in the tub as a baby and loved the water, so Sally's resting place was the tub. John Jr. loved his mama, so she kept him in the house, where he was safe and sound. You see, John had always been the delicate kind. So yeah, the woman was so obsessed with hoarding stuff and keeping her family close that she practically kept them in the house after their murder. Of course, she made them stay so that she could remember them always. However, she believed that her house wasn't big enough, so she wanted more room to fill. So she got in touch with the Cenobites, who took her to hell, a whole new world which she can fill with things. That's dark, and I believe one of the best stories yet in the entire series. The Science of Madness. This second-to-last story begins in a lab, where a scientist is examining the lament configuration, looking for answers to the questions he doesn't know. But the box is as silent as hell, doesn't speak to him, doesn't give him any answers. The man's boss was after him. After all, it was just a box. However, the scientists tried to explain that there was much more to the box than what met the eye. You see, although it was made simply of wood and metals, the X-rays showed nothing. Furthermore, the weight of the box was such that there couldn't be any lead lining. His work was getting hindered because he wasn't allowed to touch the box, and his superior reminded him time and again that under no circumstances the box ought to be touched. Frustrated that he couldn't do anything about it under the rules, he decided to break the glass protecting the box. He picked up the lament configuration and inadvertently opened it. Within no time, chains came down from all sides, slaughtering the staff. Seeing the events unfold and the blood of his colleagues splattering the walls, the scientist lost his mind. Pinhead asked the female Pinhead to stop the torture because it was a waste. You see, madness negates the gifts that the Cenobites bring. Now to the final story of this fantastic journey. The Hunted, Part 6. In the last sequence, we saw that Pinhead had summoned his friends from the labyrinth. They were here, and their demonic chain snatched the gang leader's weapon. He knew that it was time to run, but what was one man against multiple Cenobites? But the Vatican got wind of whatever was happening through CCTV cameras. They initiated something called the Damnation Protocol. The denizens had been informed about an event like this a few days prior. Now that the moment was here, they were asked to evacuate immediately. As the Vatican guards opened fire, Pinhead managed to get his pins back. Pinhead was in full revenge mode and ordered his followers to take all the artifacts along with them, including the gang leader. Unfortunately enough, this one felt a bit underwhelming. Yeah, the leader of the gang was crucified and all that, but they could have done so much more. They could have probably said that the denizens of the Vatican were the bodies that Pinhead was asking the female Cenobite at the beginning of the series. Although a missed opportunity in many respects, the same can't be said for any of the other 17 segments. Which ones did you enjoy the most? Marvelous verdict. Hellraiser Bestiary by Boom Studios is truly a roller coaster of horror through Clive Barker's twisted universe. I'll sum up what we just explored. Issue number 1 kicks off with a bang, mercenaries stealing Pinhead's pins. Classic Hellraiser chaos. Plus, Victor Laval's debut in comics adds a gritty New York edge. However, some stories like Symphony in Red miss the mark a bit, straying from the Hell Priest's essence. Jump to issue number 2 and you're hit with Old Hat to Raise the Devil, a unique story blending 1940s blues with demonic puzzles. Now, that's a tune worth listening to. Issue number 3 brings in Puzzled, a heart-tugging story about an autistic boy's obsession with puzzles. A fresh twist, but Conduit in the same issue doesn't quite match up, especially in the art department. Then there's issue number 4, where Study tries to dig deep but doesn't fully flesh out its characters. And God Will Send His Angels seems to misunderstand what Cenobites are all about. Issue number 5 is a mixed bag. Don't Look feels like it needed more pages, and Folio Do is intriguing but kind of offbeat in execution. Finally, issue number 6 wraps things up. A place for everything stands out, dark and gripping. The Science of Madness is visually stunning, but portrayal of the Hell Priest in The Hunted might leave purists a bit uneasy. The miniseries is a bit of a mixed bag. It has moments of brilliance, some narrative and artistic hiccups, but it's a fresh, if uneven, dive into the Hellraiser lore. For fans of the series or horror anthologies in general, it's worth a look. Just be ready for a bumpy ride. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one. And be safe. Thanks, everyone.